it is a backend framework, so it's on the server side. And this just means that we can use Python to build websites. So Python is one of the top programming languages. Django is one of the top frameworks for Python. It's actually the #1 used framework. So it's an absolutely great choice, great for beginners, and it makes for building websites super fast. I absolutely love it. So it is more of a heavyweight framework, so it uses a batteries included approach, and that means that it really is more opinionated in how you build out your application, and that's not a bad thing. We'll get into that later. But with this, you get more packages, libraries, and modules, and you follow a good design structure where in Python, a lightweight framework might be something like Flask, and some people may like it because it's not opinionated. But because of that, you're typically installing a lot of packages yourself. If you're newer, you may not follow the best design structure. So you may not have a good, framework or structure in how you're building your application. So the fact that Django really forces you to do things a certain way, I think is a great thing. And it does not mean that you cannot customize it. Companies customize this all the time. A lot of big organizations that have great engineers completely bend Django to their will and how they actually want things structured. So if I were to compare Django to another framework for another language, I'd probably say it's more like Rails, Ruby and Rails. With PHP and Laravel, it's more like Laravel, whereas Flask is more like Express for Node.js. And I'm trying to think of another one. I'll just use that one as the last reference, but it's more lightweight. One, you can do whatever you want. Django kind of forces you to do things a certain way, but I think that's a great thing, especially if you're newer to web development. So it uses the MVT design pattern. A lot of people may have heard of MVC, Model View Controller. For Django, it's Model View Template, and we'll get into that in a minute. So what is a web framework? So for those of you that don't even know what this is, a web framework is simply a collection of modules, packages, and libraries designed to speed up web development. So it's just kind of like a package, if you can think of it in one way, where you're not having to use Python code to do absolutely everything. It really pre-configures a lot for you and is designed for one specific purpose, in this case for building websites. So I would strongly advise against you hand coding absolutely everything by yourself. So it's going to make things a lot easier. So backend frameworks versus front-end frameworks. I already mentioned Laravel, but on the left side there, we have our backend frameworks. We have PHP, which is the language, Laravel or Laravel, however you say that, that's the framework. For Python, we have Django. There's also other ones for Python. Obviously, I mentioned Flask. For Node, we have Express. So you have the language and the framework. Now, there are front-end frameworks, so client side. These actually work well with our backend languages. So we have React, Angular, Vue. I actually used Angular and Vue with Django, so they're not in competition to each other. They handle different parts. Front-end frameworks handle all the front-end logic typically. We would probably build out some kind of API to connect to one of these, and that's how we would communicate. It doesn't mean that we need a front-end framework. Django has its own templating engine, but if you wanted to use a front-end framework, that would absolutely work. So what can you build with Django? So this is one of my favorite topics here because I like to just show the companies that use Django and let them validate the power of what Django can do. So if I were to mention a few things myself, I would say an e-commerce website, a social network. You can build out an API for a mobile app. Now Django can't actually build a mobile app for you. You can use part of Django to build one though. So if you want to provide some API data, you can do it. That's a topic for another day. So in these companies, we have Pinterest, we have Spotify, Udemy, Dropbox. All of these companies should validate whether Django is the right choice for you or if it can do what you desire it to do. So this is pretty much showing that it can do pretty much anything. Doesn't mean that it's always going to be the best option, but it can do a lot. I know Instagram relied heavily on Django in the beginning. I'm not sure what version of it they use or how much they've customized it, but I know a lot of these companies used it at some point and probably modified it to whatever they needed. Now, YouTube, I can't really confirm whether YouTube used it or not. And the reason why I put it here is because I read a lot of articles on YouTube using it. A lot of people saying that they did, but I couldn't find anything that validated it. So I put it here just to say that there's a chance that they used it, but this is something that you can build with Django. So there's no reason why you couldn't build something like a YouTube website or a YouTube-like website. So building APIs, a lot of you might be wanting to learn Django just to learn how to build out APIs, and that's totally fine. If you want to build out a mobile app or use some kind of front-end framework, you need some API data. Django makes this absolutely easy. They have something called the Django REST framework, which is built on top of Django. And the REST framework helps you build REST APIs or just APIs. So this makes this really fast. Absolutely love it. We'll get into this towards the end of the series. I'm super excited for this part. So I did want to mention some other frameworks before we get started, just to kind of let you do your own research. I mentioned Flask earlier. It's a Python-based web framework. It's more lightweight. I would recommend you check it out. I personally think Django is much better. I don't see why you'd want to use Flask, but in some cases it could be useful. Cherry Pie, Web2Py, and Pyramid. I've never used those, but I would say check it out, do your research. But I really think the competition here, if there is any, is between Django and Flask here. I wouldn't probably even mention the other three, but still, don't take my word for it, do your own research. So the MVT model structure or design pattern. So Django follows the MVT structure. There's the model view controller structure, which a lot of you from other frameworks may be familiar with. Django follows the MVT, and the only difference here is that Django takes care of the controller aspect of things. So for those of you that are completely new, MVT, we have model, the data access layer. That's your database. That's how we model data. This is going to be your database tables built out in classes. Your templates, that's your presentation layer. This is what the user sees. That's going to be their page, their web page. And then the view is the business logic. So if you were to look at an example here, we have facebook.com. And when someone goes to facebook.com, they're going to be going through some URLs here. We're going to find a URL that matches some kind of function in the backend, and that's going to be our views. Those views right there in the view layer, that's going to go ahead and get some data probably from the models, and it's going to render some kind of template to us, and we send that back to the user. So that's the flow here. We're requesting data, the views, the business logic, and we just get this and send it back to the user. So that's the MVT design pattern, very similar to MVC. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We'll start setting up our environment, and in the video after that, we will start setting up our project. Okay, so let's first start off with some helpful resources for this course as you go along with the tutorial here. So the first thing is the source code. So that is